Mm.
Now look at Paul.
Good evening, everyone. We'll just wait a few more minutes for those that are still trying to log in to our meeting today. We'll just give them a few more minutes to be able to log in. Okay, I guess we can get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second community outreach meeting for the Historic Preservation Program. My name is Mario Ariano, Assistant Planner for the City of Alhambra and Project Manager for the Historic Preservation Program. In a few moments, our consultant Heather Goers from the Historic Resource Group will begin the PowerPoint presentation for the Historic Context Statement. I would like to start off by thanking all of you who attended our first meeting back in October, and to all who have submitted comments and have shared stories and places that matter to you. I would also like to welcome all of the new, welcome all of you who are attending this meeting for the first time. Before we get started, Heather and I would like to go over a couple of things. If at any time during the presentation you have questions or would like more clarification, please use the chat. The chat has been enabled and will be monitored by Molly and Annie from the Historic Resource Group. At the conclusion of the presentation, if you would like to speak, please press the raise your hand and we will go in order as we receive them. For all of those that are joining us through telephone, at the end of the presentation, please press 9 to raise your hand. And I'm sorry, please press star 9 to raise your hand and star 6 to unmute. That is it for me. So Heather.
Thank you, Mario. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Happy New Year. As Mario said, if you joined us last time and you're here again, thank you so much. If you are new to this process and new to this meeting today, we're so glad that you could join us to hear about our work in Alhambra and how we're coming on the historic context statement. So as Mario mentioned, we have a couple of staff people here with me tonight to help man your comments and your feedback. I do not always get a chance to see the chat box until later on in the presentation when we move to the Q&A. So we have a team of top people on it tonight to help me out. just see if I can advance here. And I want to introduce them. As Mario said, my name is Heather Gores. I'm a senior architectural historian with Historic Resources Group. And with me tonight is Molly Eichert Johnson, our architectural historian and staff photographer, and also Ani Manatsakanyan, who was an intern at our last meeting, and she has since joined our staff as an associate architectural historian. So please stop by the chat and feel free to congratulate them and say hi, because we're all happy to chat with you. And so they will be fielding your questions and comments. If you joined us in our last presentation, you know that we talked a little bit about what a historic context statement is. And so for those of us who weren't able to join last time, I just want to briefly go through that. And then we'll talk in a little bit more detail about the context statement draft, which hopefully you've had a chance to review. So our project today is the historic context statement, which is really the first step in establishing a comprehensive historic preservation program. This is not the end all be all of the process. It does not end here. This is really just the beginning. And there are subsequent steps in the process that will help develop a more comprehensive program. And that includes the establishment of a Historic Resources Commission, the completion of a survey that will document existing historic resources, and also the development of a historic preservation ordinance. And each of those steps has a different purpose, but really you need all of them to happen in order to develop a comprehensive program that really provides the best protection and planning guidance for existing historic resources. So a historic context statement is usually the first step in that process. And that usually includes a narrative historic context statement, which is what is posted on the website and what we'll be talking about tonight, and also a windshield survey of properties that are built through 1980. That is our cutoff point for this survey and this historic context statement, and also the community outreach program, of which this meeting is a part. So by now you might be wondering, what is a historic context statement? Why do we even do these? And the purpose of a historic context statement is to place built resources in the appropriate context so that the relationship between those resources and an area's built environment and its relationship to the broader history can be established. And essentially what the context statement does is serves as a written document that provides the framework for documenting that history and evaluating any properties within that area for historic significance and integrity. So a context statement isn't really intended to be a comprehensive history. It will never be the be-all, end-all document of an area's history. What it does, however, is highlight trends and patterns that are specific to shaping the built environment and how that came to be developed. And we want to make sure that we understand that. There are many aspects and facets of a community's history that are intangible. And while we strive to document those the best way that we can, the one type of historic fabric that we can preserve is the built environment. So the historic context statement tends to focus on trends and elements that relate specifically to the built environment to give you the best possible context and information to serve as planning guidance moving forward. Essentially what it does is it establishes a comprehensive baseline documentation for existing potential historic resources and the context of their development. And it serves as a planning tool to guide decision-making and the future treatment of historic resources. So the context scope for historic resource or historic context statement will include any of those trends and patterns of development activity that I just described over time. And it will usually cover all chronological periods of development as it relates to the built environment. And it will address all types of properties. That includes residential properties, commercial properties, industrial properties, and also institutional properties like private institutions such as churches, and also public institutions such as schools or community resources. What this will sort of manifest as is a narrative historical overview of these trends as they are seen in the built environment today. So how do we pull all this information together? We actually do quite a bit of research to start to identify these trends and then see how they actually manifest in the built environment. So we do a very broad and extensive literature review of primary and secondary sources. We also take a look at existing surveys and assessments. We spend a lot of time looking at maps, including assessor maps and atlas maps, fire insurance maps, irrigation maps. If it's a map, we want to look at it. And we also pull a lot of historical photographs so we can get an idea of what the character and identity of the built environment looked like in the past, so we can determine how much of that remains today. And when we talk about resources remaining today, we often use the word extant, and that means essentially that it still exists. You'll see a lot of the maps that we found throughout the presentation as well. So when we've completed our research, we start to draft a chronological narrative. We take all of that information and we shape it into a narrative development history that is organized by chronological periods. And within each of those chronological periods, we identify relevant themes based on the built environment and sub-themes that are based on those resources, so we can document existing examples. And so what you see on the screen now is a list of all of the chronological periods that are identified in the draft historic context statement, which is uploaded to the website. And I'll show you how you can access that in a few slides. The first few periods are ones that predate the built environment in the city of Alhambra. And so we include them here for reference purposes only, largely to provide historical background and context for the later development of the built environment. But I also just want to note that part of the reason we include these is because there's a great deal of activity that happens during this period that does shape later development. And also because we want to make sure that we give some attention to these periods which have not always been well or fairly documented in the past. There's a brief discussion in the introduction of the context statement, which explains why we use some of the language that we use in these sections to talk about Native Americans and their experience during these very early tumultuous periods, and to reflect the development of more recent scholarship and maintain the current consistent best practices that are used in talking about the Native American experience. And that's important because even though it may not have directly influenced the built environment, it certainly impacted the population of Alhambra and the events that took place in the community, and by extension, the community's character and identity throughout history. So it's an important story to tell because it's part of the history that the built environment may reflect. And we also want to make sure that we do our job as historians in telling the stories of these communities that are important. So while these particular sections that are highlighted here are not related to any extant resources that you may see in the community today, we do try to give them at least some attention to give you an understanding of what led to later periods of development. And these later sections, starting in about 1875, are going to be the periods that we'll be talking about tonight. And what I want to do is go through each of these very briefly and just highlight some of the trends and events that helped shape construction activity during these periods. And then after we take a look at some examples of remaining development from those periods, we will have an opportunity for you guys to ask any questions or give us any feedback on the presentation or on the historic context statement itself. We are certainly ready to hear it. Even if you identified typos you want to tell us about, we're happy to hear about those too, because we're very excited about this, but we also know that we cannot make this a complete document that reflects the history and the community of Alhambra without the help of the people who reside there. So we're very grateful that you're here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. So when we look at these periods, which begin in about 1875, they are broken down and usually defined by some kind of milestone or some kind of event that defines an evolution towards the next period of development. And you can start to see how that might play out when you look at maps like this. And this is a map that shows the development in Alhambra by decade. And Robbie Arangren, who's one of the staff members who worked on this project, actually compiled this map using GIS data drawn from assessor tax data. So we're able to look at the assessor date that's assigned to each parcel within the city limits and then map that based on the decade within which the assessor date falls. So it gives us an idea when we map this at the beginning of the project of where we can expect to find concentrations of development dating from a particular time period throughout the community. So if you look at it from that standpoint, the colors start to make a little bit more sense. For example, when we look at 1940 to 1949, which is purple, we see very large concentrations in particular areas that were redeveloped from or larger earlier properties at that time. You start to see many properties from 1920 to 1929, which was when most of the residential construction was erected in the city. You start to see large swaths of residential parcels from 1920 to 1929. And if you're curious about this map, we will have this, we are going to upload the presentation to the website following the conclusion tonight. So that will be available tomorrow, and we will also be, by popular demand after last time, we will also be uploading all of the historic photos. So you can get a closer look at everything that we're showing up there tonight if you go back to the website tomorrow. So 1875 to 1902. This is one of the earliest periods of development in Alhambra, and it commences with the opening of the Alhambra tract in April 1875. The Alhambra addition is recorded and opened up for sale once that tract was fully settled. And these are the two tracts that really defined the establishment of Alhambra and represent most of the physical area of the city today. But that was made possible only by the opening of the Southern Pacific Railroad, which is extended through the San Gabriel Valley in 1873 and really opened up the entire valley for development. So that was part of the reason that those tracts were able to succeed. And in addition, the irrigation efforts and innovations by James DeBarth Shore made the Alhambra tract and the Alhambra addition particularly desirable, and they were able to succeed in attracting customers and lot buyers at a time when other residential tracts were not, because they offered irrigation, which many lots could not. It also made the area particularly attractive for agricultural operations, and the tracts were divided into 5 and 10 acre lots, which made them ideal for cultivation. So it was expected that if you were to buy a lot in Alhambra, that you would very likely be farming on some kind of, at least a small scale of a 5 or 10 acre farm, where you may likely be cultivating citrus or some other type of produce. This slide, actually, I'm sorry, I got too excited talking about the produce. It's led to the establishment of the San Gabriel Winery as well in 1882 due to grape cultivation. And the area really became a hub for agriculture. And as people were drawn to the area to cultivate their land, they were able to develop a fledgling community. And this was transformed in the 1880s by the land boom and the first subdivision of the original Alhambra tract lots. So as more and more people drew to the area, they were looking to subdivide land to create more opportunity for real estate development. And the first subdivision was in 1883. And the first subdivision of commercial land occurred in 1886, which you see here. And that was the Pomeroy and Stimson subdivision, which was surveyed in 1886 and then recorded in 1887. What's important about this, even though when we look at Alhambra today, the only known extant resources that date from this period are single-family residences. What's important to remember is that this is how the organization of the town was shaped during this time. It was through the subdivisions of land. It was through the development of a commercial corridor along Main Street, through the subdivision of tracts like Pomeroy and Stimson, that actually developed the landscape that you see today, with that Main Street commercial corridor and the residential subdivisions that surrounded it. And so this is when the actual landscape of Alhambra first began to take shape. So the extant resources, as I mentioned, that date from this period are all single-family residences. This is based, as far as we can tell, on assessor dates only, and we did not verify that with additional research outside the scope of this survey. So I did not list them individually here. They are mentioned in the report, but I want to make clear we are identifying them based on tax assessor dates only, and we are using them as examples of resources from this period, but that in and of itself does not convey any kind of potential eligibility. That is something that will come in later phases of the project when you start to undertake a more comprehensive citywide survey effort. 1903 to 1919 is the second period. And this is one that's particularly important because Alhambra was incorporated in 1903. And as a city, they were able to undertake many more infrastructural improvements and additions to municipal resources, because now they could offer bond elections. And if voters were to approve a bond, there would be funding for additional improvements, which is how many of those additional municipal services came to be established during this period. There was also an adjacent community established named Dolgeville, which would come to be particularly important in Alhambra history. It was established on the site of the former San Gabriel Winery and became known as the Standard Felt Company through the activities of Alfred Dolge. And Dolgeville was actually annexed to Alhambra in 1908, along with the adjacent communities of Ramona and Shorb, which gave the city much of the footprint that you see today. And this was not substantially improved until the 1940s. There were also early efforts at commercial booster organizations, which really saw the agricultural operations and particularly citrus farming taking off, with the establishment of the Alhambra Board of Trade and the Chamber of Commerce later in 1913. And those organizations really worked to drive the presence of Alhambra and its agricultural product within the larger national market. So Alhambra actually became a household name. Alhambra was cultivating and shipping more oranges than many of the adjacent San Gabriel Valley communities combined. So that really became a pillar of the community's identity throughout the 1910s and 1919 into the early 1920s, which we'll see in a second. Dolgeville was located to the west of the Alhambra Addition Tract, and they were largely concerned with felt operations. One of their products they offered was Cozy Toes slippers. And if you or someone in your family ever purchased Cozy Toes slippers, I would love to hear about it in the chat, because we've been searching for products that were actually manufactured by Standard Felt. And I found this slide. We were super excited about the slippers. And I would love to hear your Cozy Toes story if any of you have Standard Felt Company products. Residential development also played a significant role during this period because of the population increase during this time. Not quite as substantial as 1920 to 1940, but what you really started to see was the first organized effort at residential neighborhoods. Because up until 1903, there were some minor subdivisions over time by people who wanted to subdivide their own 5 or 10 acre lots. But beginning in 1903, you start to see much more organized efforts by land development companies who were undertaking much more large scale activity. They were buying up several parcels and subdividing into many lots and undertaking speculative housing construction. So the character of residential development during this time really changed and became much more large scale. Two of the neighborhoods that were particularly prominent at the time were Ramona Park, and you can see one advertisement there from 1907. And also Linda Roxa Park from 1912, which you can see there on the left. The 1920s to the 1940s is the most active period of development in the history of Alhambra. It is difficult to overstate how much actually took place during these 20 years. Overall, between 1920 and 1940, the population on the whole increased 328%, which is astonishing to think about. Within the 1920s themselves, just within that decade, over 100 residential tracts were recorded. So the land boom, the population boom had a substantial impact on the landscape of Alhambra. And during this period is when the city started to take the shape that you see today. The Alhambra Industrial Syndicate, which was established in 1923, started shifting the city's identity away from a center of agriculture to one of industry. And by 1938, there was sufficient industrial activity that additional freight line was added. We were also looking at larger trends that were present across the country, like an increase in private automobile ownership, which had a drastic effect on how commercial buildings were designed, because we were now thinking about how to attract people who are not traveling on foot through Main Street, but actually driving in cars. And it shaped the way commercial businesses were designed, the way that they were marketed from the street rather than from the sidewalk. And there was an influx of automobile-related commercial properties. This was the beginning of Automobile Row in Alhambra on Main Street as more and more automobile-related services popped up. Of course, one of the most influential and prominent commercial operations of this period was the opening of the Alhambra Airport. And also the Long Beach earthquake had a substantial impact on construction as well. And we'll talk about that in one of the upcoming slides here, like this one. The Long Beach earthquake in 1933 was singular in its effect on institutional construction in Southern California, because one of the things that was realized almost immediately was how many school buildings were not equipped to withstand a substantial earthquake. And shortly after the Long Beach earthquake, there was the establishment of the Field Act in 1933. And what the Field Act did was mandate earthquake-resistant safety standards for the construction of public schools in California. And while there had been a number of schools constructed in Alhambra by this date already, many of them were found upon survey after the earthquake to not meet the standards of the Field Act. So this actually sparked a boom in school reconstruction. Some buildings were modified, some were renovated, some were actually removed and rebuilt on that same footprint. And that activity began in the 1930s and continued through the 1960s. So you start to see a much larger trend in school construction and also school renovation during this period. After the stock market crash of 1929, many other construction efforts, commercial and institutional, largely would have stalled. However, with the establishment of the Public Works Administration in 1933 and the Works Progress Administration in 1935, we were able to actually identify some PWA and WPA projects that were constructed in Alhambra, including the post office that you see here on the lower left, and also improvements to the Alhambra Park. And there was also a pedestrian tunnel, which we were very excited to hear about, that was school related. I'm also very disappointed to find that it has since been closed, but we did document it as a WPA project. Commercial development during this time, as I mentioned, was primarily focused along the Main Street corridor. The beginnings of Auto Row were developing as dealerships, automobile repair shops, gas stations were opening along Main Street. And this kind of went hand in hand. As there was more commercial activity, it made sense to locate those automobile related businesses on Main Street. But then as those businesses were established, it also brought further commercial activity. Again, the opening of the 1930 Alhambra Airport was a turning point in shifting Alhambra even further away from that agricultural model towards a more advanced and capitalistic community. And this was confirmed in 1932 with the closure of the Alhambra Orange Growers Association, simply because there was not enough commercial or citrus activity to warrant continuation. And Molly, I just saw your note. If there is an issue with the slide that I'm not aware of, let me know.
You're all good. Continue.
Sometimes there's a bit of a lag when I press the button. And so I sometimes do it once too many times, thinking it hasn't registered. Residential development was probably the largest sector of growth between 1920 and 1940, which makes sense if the population is increasing by 328%. entire neighborhoods, like I said, over 100 tracts were recorded in the 1920s alone. Some of the most notable tracts of this period included the Mayfair tract, as you see here, in 1929, also Emery Park, and the Orange Blossom Manor tract as well. There are so many examples literally from this period, it's almost tough to sort of pick and choose a few. So what we did was actually show this map, which was included in a manual about school construction in Alhambra that was published in the 1930s. And as part of this manual, they explained some of the studies they undertook in deciding where to locate new elementary schools. And in doing so, they actually measured and counted how many building permits were filed for new construction during certain years of the 1920s, on the basis that if there was new construction concentrated in a particular area, those families were likely to have children, and ergo a school would likely be a necessity in that area in the near future. So I wanted to show you this map, which shows the location of residential building permits filed between 1923 and 1927. And this gives us an idea of, on a really broad scale, of where people were starting to locate during this period, where was land being subdivided, where were neighborhoods and new subdivisions and new tracts opening up, where was new construction happening that is consistent with character activity from the 1920s. 1941 to 1945. It's a really short period, but it's a really interesting one in Alhambra because there are a couple of things that happened during this period that actually lead to larger developments in the post-war era. Again, beginning in the 1920s and 30s, they start to move away from the agricultural model, and we're looking at more commercial and industrial activity. And this was confirmed in the 1940s with the conversion of many of those manufacturing facilities for wartime production. The Alhambra Airport played an important role during World War II as well. The electric rail line was abandoned, which shifted the pedestrian activity throughout Alhambra, and also the freight rail remained because industrial activity was still present. Because of the war effort, there was very little construction during this period. However, there were two events that set up the subsequent development in the post-war era, and that was the closure of the Midway Country Club and also the sale of the Alhambra Airport. The Midway Country Club actually was in decline for several years and was sold at auction after declaring bankruptcy in 1941. And it was sold to Alhambra's Banana King, Dominic Jebbia, which thrills me to no end. And he was deciding what to do with the property, and a fire occurred at the country club in 1944, which effectively wiped out some of the facilities. So this land was annexed to the city through multiple annexations for subsequent development beginning in 1941. The airport was sold in 1945 and then shut down shortly thereafter. This is a photo showing the facilities when it was sort of in full swing. But those two milestones right there, the closure of the country club and the sale of the airport, would really prove to be the linchpins of post-war residential development in Alhambra. And I just, on a somewhat more entertaining note, I wanted to note 1941 was huge for commercial activity, in that three of some of Alhambra's most beloved restaurants opened that same year, including Fosselman's Ice Cream, Bun and Burger, and also the Chili Bowl, which sadly is no longer a Chili Bowl, but it is still there. 1946 to 1967 is probably the second most influential period of development in the history of Alhambra, largely because of the post-war housing boom. While the population growth was not as intense during this period, the land development was far more so. Much of the land that was developed for residential construction during this period was annexed from adjacent sites like the country club and also the airport. So much of the concentrated residential development was happening in those two locations. Valley Boulevard also began to evolve as a commercial corridor, And there was a decline in industrial operations, which we'll talk about in a bit of a later section. This is just to give you an idea of how annexations were influencing development at this time. This is a map of annexations throughout the history of Alhambra, and you see the initial annexations are pink, and then all of the subsequent ones, which began in the 1940s, are further down, are yellow and blue. Yellows are 1940 to 1949, and blue is 1950 to 1959. So you can start to see how these areas that comprised the Mid-Country Club and also the Alhambra Airport came into being during this time. And to give you a sense of the impact on the landscape, there's actually this comparison photo of the Country Club in 1932, is it? And then also in 1953. The sheer scale of development was unprecedented at this point in time. A number of institutions and commercial operations were established during this period simply to meet the needs of the growing community. Many of the returning GIs that had worked in the area and were part of those wartime manufacturing operations or worked at the airport decided to return and settle in the community. And many of them had wives and families and young children, and this precipitated the post-war housing boom. But it also meant that Alhambra needed additional community services, larger city hall, more schools, more churches, more restaurants, more of everything to simply meet the demand. And when you start to do a deep dive into the post-war housing boom, Kevin Starr has a really good discussion of it. We talk about it as being explosive, but it was explosive very fast in a way that many of the communities in Southern California were just unable to meet as quickly as the demand arose. And so there were actually real intense and difficult problems associated with meeting the needs of those communities, like where to put returning soldiers and how were they going to feed them, because even food supplies were running short. And I found one picture which really intrigued me that we're going to follow up on in our ongoing research. They actually set up a community for returning GIs at the site of the Alhambra city dump. And there's a picture of trailers that were constructed to just meet the very critical need for housing as these soldiers returned from war. Some of the community resources that were developed during this period were the new City Hall, which was constructed in 1960, and also Martha Baldwin School, which was constructed in 1950, down there in the lower right. And the beloved The Hat opened in 1951. I'm very disappointed to say we did not get enough survey days to come out and try all of the restaurants, including The Hat, that we wanted to sample. Crawford's Corner was probably the most representative example of post-war commercial development. It opened in 1964 and evolved as a family operation from some prior grocery stores that had been owned by the Crawford family. Beginning in 1968, post-war development in Alhambra really took on a different character with the establishment of the Alhambra Redevelopment Agency. As many of the industrial properties in Alhambra began to decline in the years following the war, when much of that wartime manufacturing activity left, there was a certain degree of blight that was considered to be present. And the establishment of redevelopment agencies throughout Southern California was intended to combat the effects of blight on downtown areas and industrial areas in these communities. So the Alhambra Redevelopment Agency was established to help spur the redevelopment of existing industrial sites. And in many cases, that was impacted by the development of condominiums and was the result in an increase in multifamily residential development. So the character of residential development during this period shifted away from much of the single family housing that we saw in earlier periods that were characterized by large swaths of land like you saw in the Mid-Country Club and the Alhambra Airport tract, with large swaths of land with parcels with single family homes. We're looking at much higher density housing development during this period, especially with the development of condos and condominium laws in 1970s. There are also a number of community services and commercial buildings that were opened during this period that remain today, including the Alhambra Community Hospital, which you see here. These are two very happening 70s photos on the top, believe it or not. The Alhambra Community Hospital in 1974, and also the Sears Roebuck and Company Pacific Coast Territory headquarters in 1971. I am from Chicago, and so my first instinct is to call it the Sears Tower, which I think anyone from Chicago would probably take issue with, but I can't think of it as anything else. And also Home Savings, 1978. This was designed by the Millard Sheets studio. Millard Sheets had previously done work in Alhambra at Mark Keppel High School, which we saw a couple of slides back. There are several significant murals there. He had passed away by 1978, but Millard Sheets studio had been established to continue to work with Home Savings. And that studio was responsible for the artwork on the bank here. And also the courthouse, which was constructed in 1974. So as you can see, we've taken sort of a brief cruise through some of the most prominent and active periods of development in history. However, we have a few things that are still subjects of ongoing research for us, including the community submissions, which I'll talk more about in a second. Important individuals, including the residents that belong to James DeBrush Schwartz. Someone asked about that at our last community presentation about whether that house has been relocated, and I'm still working on that, and a couple of other individuals as well. We wanted to do a little bit more discussion in our final draft about the development of Ramona and Shorb, those adjacent town sites that were eventually incorporated into the boundaries of the city of Alhambra. Artists Alley is one that we're still researching as well, along with the reconstruction of those educational facilities in the later years following the Field Act. And also post-war exclusionary policies. There's a discussion of those exclusionary policies, as I mentioned, throughout the report, but there are some in the later sections that we feel might benefit from greater discussion in terms of how they actually impacted the built environment as other communities began to migrate to Alhambra. So you'll see a little bit more about that as well. Community outreach. We were thrilled with the response to our last presentation, and we're thrilled with how people were excited about properties and using the submit a comment form on the website. We had over 30 submissions. Some of them were about the same properties. So when you see them on the website, they're actually condensed, where if there were multiple submissions for a property, they're sort of paraphrased into one. You can see everything that's been submitted if you go to the website and click on community submissions. And if this has spurred you to think about one that you want to submit as well, either an event or a milestone or a trend or a particular property, you can click on get involved and fill out the brief form. And you'll see that they ran the gamut, which was absolutely great. We were thrilled to see everything that everyone submitted because these are the resources in your community that you're excited about. And so we couldn't be happier to see how many of them made your list. And there were some submissions that were stunning in their detail, and they were so informative and researched and with citations and maps. And we regret that we can't share some of those on the website, but we are not, unfortunately, at liberty to present and post content that is not ours, that was not developed by HRG. So I certainly appreciate the dedication that is evident in the writing, and we have taken that information and incorporated it where we can. And we have certainly read every single one, and we'll go through them again before we finalize the draft, to make sure that we have addressed everything that we are able to. But just so you know, if you don't see something that you submitted verbatim, that is why. We are just not at liberty to post extensive content that we did not develop. But we thank you for this. This was amazing and gave us a completely different outlook on some of these properties. One of the comments in our last presentation was about the library, which I mentioned a couple of slides back, and how there was a new library developed in the later post-war period. And I would like to, someone said that 4 times since the previous library had been red tagged, there was a Quonset hut that was set up to serve as the interim library. And if anyone has a photo of that library Quonset hut, I would love to see it. I've been unable to find one. We've been looking for several months now since the last presentation. If you know of a photo of that Quonset hut library, I would love to see it so we can include it in the report. So the next steps now are that the 75% draft has been uploaded to the website. And if you kind of stumbled upon this medium without reading the draft, you can access it online if you go to the website, Historic Alhambra, and click on Documents. And it should be right at the top, Draft Historic Context Statement. And we will leave the comment period open for that document until February 28th. And after that, we will take all of your comments and our comments from the city and go back to our desks and finalize that historic context statement, make it into a 100% draft. And then in the spring, we will present that to the Planning Commission and also to the City Council. So we have a little over a month left to hear your comments and your questions and your feedback. And we're certainly hoping to do that. As I said last time, you know, we may be experts in developing these reports, but we're certainly not experts in the city of Alhambra. And we are guests here, and we would love to hear more about what you think it is essential for us to include. And we will do our best to do that. So I want to make sure that we have every opportunity possible to hear from you and hear about what you think of the draft. If you think that what we have shown you so far is representative to how you feel the history of the time period relates to the built environment, if you think there's anything that we should add, if there's anything that we have missed, if you have any questions about how anything was explained in the report or any of the buildings mentioned, now is your chance certainly to post those in real time. But we will also have a month to hear from you through the Get Involved box and the submissions in Cell. So if you have any questions, I think we can go ahead. And again, here's the Get Involved box. And here's where you can submit your comments as well. You can also just send us an email at historicalhambra@cityofalhambra.org. And if you have any questions now, I think we can take those.
Right. So if we have a couple of questions that came in through the chat box, but if anybody else has any questions, either drop them in the chat box or press the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to you as quickly as we can. So our first question is from Oscar Amaro. He says he remembers reading some years ago law records from the 1930s where the city of Alhambra, quote unquote, annexed the land belonging to one of the founders. It could have been FQ Story's land, and actually took him to court over water rights. It didn't sound like a friendly annexation. So did we find that these hostile annexations were common?
Oscar, I will say that in my experience as a historian, almost none of the annexations that had to do with water rights were ever friendly. And that's just a broad statement. I will say I noticed you used annexations in quotes, and that's an interesting distinction. We pulled the list of annexations that appear throughout the historic context statement, actually from the city and county websites, the County of LA's record of annexations in the county. And I do not recall one from the 1930s that is specific to private land. All of the annexations that occurred over time, they stopped in 1917 and didn't pick up again until 1940. That is not to say that there was not some type of informal deal that occurred that was not recorded as an annexation if the city acquired private land that may have been already technically within the city boundaries, but was being acquired likely, I'm guessing, through eminent domain for some type of city purpose, namely water rights. That would be very likely to be an unfriendly transaction, as it were. I don't recall an annexation of private land being recorded, period, much less from the 30s. But I absolutely believe that it's possible there could have been some kind of informal, quote unquote, transaction that was maybe not willing, a willing acquisition on both sides. So I'm going to make a note of that, and we will look into that, because I do recall there was something about Francis Q. Story's land being annexed, and it would not surprise me if it wasn't over water rights. that was not an uncommon reason for cities to take land throughout the 20th century. I hate to say it, but true. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I'm going to log that so we can look into that for the draft.
Well, thank you for that. We have one raised hand right now. Can we unmute Melissa Michelson, please?
One second.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Melissa. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you again for all of this. And I think, just speaking personally, you guys are doing an amazing job. I'm still very excited about this whole project. I have 3 questions.
Sure.
One is about just general about the website and everything that you're putting together. How long, will that exist later after you're done? Can the public, will we be able to access it later? It's great. That's my first question.
I'll just add, the website is entirely Molly's creation.
Oh, wow.
She did a fantastic job putting it together. Yeah. So I want to make sure that she gets credit for it because it looks great.
Thank you very much.
Carry on.
Credit goes to Squarespace. The website will outlive this phase of the project. We're going to transfer ownership of it over to the city after we're done. And so after that, it will be up to the city to keep it up and to keep access open to you guys. But I'm sure that that will continue at least throughout this entire historic preservation program project. And probably the content will migrate to the overall city website in some fashion afterwards.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question is, I live close to the Dolgeville area, and there are very, very few leftover working, workers' homes that were on Fremont. And one of them used to be on Fremont, Victorian, and it fell into disrepair, and then it got demolished, and then the lot was split, and then they built these 2 large structures. But I took pictures of that before it went away. They're not historic pictures. Is that something that you guys need? If not, I'll just keep them by myself. I don't think it's a special house other than the fact that it was in the area, but who knows?
I would be really interested in the address, if nothing else.
Okay.
Because I'd just be interested in taking a look at what that worker housing looked like, if we have a known extant example that has that specific association. Mm-hmm. I think the photos will come in more handy during the next phase of the project when we start to, or the city starts to look at doing a survey. And this is my point to plug again. This as a context statement seems like a big undertaking in and of itself, but it's part of a much larger process. Once the context statement is approved, the city is going to start to look at those next steps, including the commission and the survey, which is another point down the line, and will be similar, in scope and time and staffing by a consulting firm to the historic context statement. So there will be other opportunities in the process, certainly for those properties to be looked at on a more individual level than what we're able to do here.
Okay, so I'll just send the address then and you could look at it.
That would be perfect. Perfect.
And then my last question is, well, not a question, but a concern about the Shorb Mansion and the Halstead House. I think the Shorb Mansion was just sold, and now there's new owners. And then I think that was like in December, and then Halstead House was new ownership in April, I think. And we don't have anything protecting right now, but I'm wondering if the city can send a letter to them or leave a little note for them saying something. I wouldn't run it past to the real, I don't know why they bought the homes. I don't know if the real estate agents told them that it's a historic home or if they even knew, but just if either you or the city could notify them that they got a great piece of property there. So, and to take care of it. Thank you.
I would defer to Mario and Vanessa on that. But what I will say is this, first of all, when we talk about property being historic, that can be a really broad term. So what I usually like to say is if a property is eligible, which means technically, yes, that it is historic because it's eligible for historic designation. So in order to be eligible for historic designation, a property has to have two components. It has to possess sufficient historic significance, but it also has to possess sufficient historic integrity. And that means that it actually still has the physical elements that convey that historic character and identity. So we can't just have a property that's historically significant. It also has to have sufficient ability to convey that significance physically in order to be eligible. And what we are doing with the historic context statement is essentially we're looking at the first part. We're setting up the baseline documentation to help determine historic significance. But because of the scope of the context statement, we do not have the ability at this point to determine if something is eligible for historic designation. We can say that maybe based on these development trends that a property might possess sufficient historic significance, but you really need to do a much more comprehensive citywide survey to start determining eligibility. So I'm not sure at this point, based on the work that we have done, that we would be able to say any individual property is eligible for historic designation, simply because that's sort of outside the scope of what we've been able to do. That might be determined down the road as part of the more comprehensive survey. But that's why I just want to stop you and say, hold on, I don't know if we can say it's historic per se. What the city would like to do about that in the meantime is something that we would certainly defer to them on.
I mean, the Halstead house is, what is it, the oldest existing house in Alhambra, and then the Shorb house was his home, right? So
correct.
I don't know. I mean, what can you notify the city, or it's like, I don't know. I just say that they're possibly historically relevant. But I'll leave that up to you. But thank you very much.
Yeah. No, and thank you. And Melissa sent us several submissions. I don't know if I'm telling tales out of school, including a beautiful, detailed Google map. So I want to make sure to thank you for your efforts. But yeah, that's a question we'll have to work out with the city.
Thank you for all of those detailed questions. We have a few more raised hands. Sure. And then we have another question in the chat box. But Catherine Acosta has been waiting for a while, so let's unmute her.
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Good. Can you hear me? Yes,
I can.
Well, thank you again for putting this presentation together. So I have kind of a question to build off of the last one, which is, I know in the first meeting it was mentioned that cultural significance, as opposed to architectural and historic architecture significance, is also being considered. And I would assume that there would be, perhaps this would be also fleshing out criteria for a culturally significant spot that might be not so strong in terms of architecture. And I just wanted to say that I'm in the process of sending you guys' way this month through the outreach of the website, information about the Vans store here in Alhambra, located at 420 South Garfield. The building is from the 1950s, but I actually work for Vans corporate headquarters in Costa Mesa, and I am the brand's archivist and historian.
I just had some palpitations. That's very exciting.
So it is the longest and oldest standing Vans store in Southern California, and
really?
We, the brand, have owned it since 1980, but we've been occupying that space since I believe as early as 1968.
Okay.
Which is only 2 years after Vans was founded in Anaheim in 1966. And I'm doing as much research as I can to give you guys as much information to help build larger awareness. And you'll be getting an email and a submission from me shortly. I also have identified 3 historic photos in our company archive. One is
fantastic
of the exterior that's from about 1973, and then there are 2 other ones that show the interior, but I need to do a little more digging to confirm. So I
Okay.
just want to say that that's a really special thing, and I just want to throw it out to the group of people that are on this call.
Oh, that's fantastic. Catherine, I don't know why I'm up here. I feel like we want to hear about your job, quite frankly. I feel like I should turn the screen sharing over now.
No, but I guess my question really is how much emphasis or support is going into a cultural landmark and significance? It seems like obviously this is, a lot of these sites lean into both areas, but
yes,
that was my general question.
No, that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked, because it's one that I think, and sometimes when we do these presentations, I forget that the subtle nuances of some of the terms that we use in a technical way in terms of evaluations are also terms that we also kind of toss around on an everyday basis. And so they can get mixed up and back and forth when we talk about cultural significance versus architectural significance, or something being historic versus being eligible. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to clarify this a little bit. When we talk about cultural significance versus architectural significance, what we're really referring to is essentially the reasons why a building or a property can be important. If a building is architecturally significant, it is likely because of literally its architecture, exactly what's in the term. So it's going to have to do with the physical construction or the physical design of the building, or essentially what it looks like, its physical character. So one of the sections in the historic context statement that we did not review tonight, which is at the very end, is about architecture and design. And that is where you'll find a lot of the discussion regarding architectural significance. Cultural significance has to do with the aspects of significance or the aspects of a property's history that are important, that do not necessarily relate to its architecture or its physical character. So they may be independent of how it was designed, how it looks, how it was constructed. Essentially, the periods that we went through tonight are the references and the milestones for cultural significance, because those are the ones that are more intangible. And a lot of cultural significance is intangible. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of things that are intangible that we can't preserve. And ultimately, we end up preserving a lot of buildings because they are physical representations of something that is intangible, like cultural history, like vans or fossilmans. We're not necessarily looking at fossilmans or a store like that because of its architectural merit. We're looking at it because it's fossilmans. And that's sort of the subtle difference between being architecturally significant versus being culturally significant. So yes, you're correct. There are some properties, many properties, in fact, that may be eligible for both architectural significance because it was designed by a prominent architect, or it's an exemplary example of a particular architectural style that also has cultural significance because of its historical associations to the history and development of Alhambra. It's very possible for a building to be both, but it does not have to possess architectural significance in order to be important in and of itself as it relates to the history of Alhambra. And I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
Yes, and thank you so much for that. And yeah, I look forward to connecting further and sharing the information that I have about that store.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. The post-war businesses is something that we're very interested in. So I would love to hear more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That actually ties into our question that's been hanging out in the chat box. So why don't we just continue on with that? And Chris Olson will get to you in just a second, I promise. So Heather, who determines the criteria for what's historically significant? Is it a prominent local person, or does it have to be someone of wider renown?
I did skim this while you were talking, Molly. So I see Oscar asked this, and this is a great question. Who determines the criteria for what is historically significant? That is an excellent, excellent question. We have sometimes found that people believe that we just make this up in our heads. We do not. I've occasionally been asked to cite, our evaluations, and I have to say, well, we actually there is supporting framework for this. There's instructions essentially from the United States government. In terms of who determines the criteria for what is historically significant, that's determined on several levels. So I'm going to give you a bit of a theoretical example. As the city of Alhambra does not currently have a preservation program in place for preservation planning. If you reside in a city that does have a preservation planning program, which Alhambra will in very short order when they adopt an ordinance and seat the commission, the determination and by extension, the definition of what is historically significant or historically eligible is usually contained within that city ordinance. Those decisions and those definitions are almost always developed at a local level because they are related to local planning issues. So it's almost always the local municipal body who is establishing those definitions because they're related to local planning issues. However, that being said, the majority of cities and counties and communities who have adopted historic preservation programs and have established those definitions for themselves rely on guidance from the federal government that is developed by the National Park Service and the Secretary of the Interior, who have established definitions that have been in place for several decades now regarding the thresholds for what makes a property historically eligible. Not only historically significant, but also historically eligible when both significance and integrity combine to create a property that is eligible for designation. And that's really what you're primarily concerned with from a planning perspective, because it's those historic designations that may trigger special planning attention. Whether something is in and of itself historically significant is somewhat less impactful because you need to have integrity to trigger eligibility. And it's eligibility that is tied to, and designation that is tied to planning decisions. So if you're interested in the larger framework, which many communities, because it has been established by the federal government and is well tested and has been utilized in many communities across the country for decades now, if you're interested in looking at that framework and those definitions, we can certainly provide some links on the website to look at most of the framework and thresholds that many communities just opt to carry forward. Sometimes with minor tweaks, if they feel that their particular community has special considerations that warrant additional guidance or additional definitions in terms of what constitutes a historic resource. But by and large, for the most part, it's guidance from the federal government that gets carried down to local communities. So that being said, is it a prominent local person or does it have to be someone renowned? It can, yes and no. It's a combined answer. The definition for how a property may be determined to be historically significant for its association with a significant individual depends on that individual's level of significance. So that person may be significant at the national level, it may be significant at the local level, they may be significant at the state level. At any of those three junctures, if they're able to meet the threshold for significance, they may be considered a significant individual. However, for a property, a particular property, to be considered significant for that property's association with the important individual, that property itself has to play an important role in that individual's significance. And I hope you can follow that train because it does get a little convoluted. But for instance, let's say if we're talking, this is a very broad example. If we're talking about George Washington, and we're looking at two properties, and one of them is Mount Vernon, and the other property is an inn that George Washington stayed a single night at. In terms of historic significance for its association with George Washington as an important individual, by far, we would look at Mount Vernon as the more valid and complementary example of a property that is significant for its association with George Washington, because he didn't just stay there a single night. That was a property that he purchased, that he developed himself. He lived there for a long period of time during his most active years in the government. And you have to kind of build that relationship and have a really solid connection between the activities that made an individual person important and their association with that particular property, if that makes sense. And if that did not answer your question, Oscar, because I got a little far afield, let me know and I will try to clarify.
And Oscar
it makes sense. Oh, thank you.
Sometimes
I get so carried away with the explanation. I'm halfway through and I think maybe this isn't answering the question. So I'm glad to hear that it did.
So can we unmute Chris Olson and hear their questions?
Thank you so much. First of all, I have 2 points of praise, and the first is for Catherine Acosta. I was blown away to hear that about the van store.
Isn't that fantastic? I'm happy. If she had a PowerPoint ready to go, I'd just turn my screen over to her right now.
Well, there are a number of us on this call tonight. I've heard from 2 of them who are likely to be board members on the newly revived and reinvigorated Alhambra Historical Society.
Oh, fantastic.
And museum. So we would love to hear from Catherine Acosta regarding the archival information and history of the van store in Alhambra. And I would not be surprised if that building is significant architecturally. But so yes, please contact us. And the second thing is just to say what a wonderful, wonderful job Historic Resources Group has done on this project so far. You are absolutely the class of the field.
Oh,
and
thank you.
I very, very much hope, I have a fair amount of knowledge of historic preservation myself and of Alhambra's architectural history. I'm really hoping that your firm will bid on the Historic Resources Survey, which I understand will be a separate project.
Correct.
And
that's a separate phase.
I just can't say enough about how much I want you guys to
thank you.
do that work. So
thank you. That's so kind of you to say. I thank you on behalf of all of us. I'm just the voice of this, but there are many people who put hours of energy into this. So thank you. I will share that with our team for sure. And Chris, I have to thank you. I know this is the second meeting I think that you've been at. So thank you for returning to the well to talk with us again.
I'll always show up for historic preservation.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of that. I don't see any other questions or hands raised, but if you have more questions, please raise your hand or drop it in the chat right now. Otherwise, I think we can kind of wrap up.
And like I said, this is just your chance to talk to us in real time. If you go to bed tonight and you're staring at the ceiling and you're thinking, man, I wish I would have told them about another van store or another Fosselman's or Quonset hut, please, the box is open for another month and we are happy to hear your suggestions and your comments and your photos and your buildings. This has been such a great ride for us at HRG to be able to take with you and experience the city through your eyes. So we can't wait to hear what else you have to say.
All right, I think that about does it. So thank you guys all for coming and for listening to our whole spiel about historic Alhambra.
I do want to.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This is Scott. I do want to jump in and say that when we do end this webinar, for those who are attending, you may see a survey. I'm hoping it works. We'll find out. But you'll see a survey at the end. Thumbs up, thumbs down on the presentation. If you give a thumbs down, it'll ask you what can we do better for the next time. We would invite you to give us that feedback if you decide to do a thumbs down. Otherwise, thank you guys.
And thank you to Scott for making sure that we ran smoothly today.
You're welcome.
All right, and with that, I think we can go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you all for
Okay.
coming.
Thank you all so much. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.